Okay, so today we're going to talk about different types of migration. So, as we look at migration, there are a couple of different things. First is internal migration, which, when you follow the internal migration path, which is down here, you can see interregional or intra-regional migration. And interregional is historically rural to urban migration for jobs. We see this a lot within our society, here in the United States and in other countries around the world. And then intra is usually within urban areas from cities to suburbs. So as you see people kind of leaving the cities and going to live in suburb areas where they can have larger homes, a larger yard, things like that, that would be intra-regional. And then we have international, which there's two types of international. There's voluntary and forced. With voluntary, this is where you're choosing to migrate. Usually it's economic or environmental reasons. With forced, these are people who are refugees, asylum seekers, and usually that's related to cultural or sometimes environmental as well. So let's break these down a little bit more. So if you are going to permanently move from one country to another, it's international migration. And like I mentioned before, that can be either voluntary or involuntary, which is forced. A permanent move within the same country is international. Internal migration. Interregional is one region to another. Generally, like I mentioned, urban to rural. Intra is with one region, usually suburb, from older cities to newer suburbs. And you've really seen the intra-regional movement really be happening in the last 50 years in the United States. Prior to really after the Civil War, you're going to see a lot of interregional, especially of African Americans moving out of the South in rural areas to the suburban North to get jobs, generally in manufacturing. As that has those manufacturing jobs have gone away, you're seeing people again migrate out of those places in the North to areas in the Sun Belt where these factories have moved. So types of migration in Mexico, you have the international and internal. So Mexico's two principal patterns of international migration are net in migration from Central America. So they're seeing a lot of people moving in to Mexico from Central America. As we've seen with some of these Central American countries, their governments are fairly unstable. There's a lot of political problems there, a lot of violence. So you're seeing people flee those areas into Mexico. And then once you're having a net out migration to the United States. So you're seeing inter-regional migration flows are in net migration from the south to the north and from the center to the north. Mexico's principal intra-regional migration is flow from Mexico City to the outer states in Mexico's metropolitan area. So you can kind of see on the map, here's where people are moving out of the city. And as people are moving from central and southern Mexico into the United States, and some people from Central America are coming into Mexico and then kind of almost passing through and maybe stay for a while. Some stay forever and then passing to the United States. So the first type is voluntary migration, and this is migration is a permanent movement undertaken by choice. This may be transnational, which is across international borders. It could be internal within international borders. Chain, which is following relatives. You hear about chain migration, like one person moves and they can move their family. Step or series of small, less extreme moves. I have a feeling that some of you at some point in your life might do some step migration where you're moving in an internal way in the United States to different areas for jobs or economic reasons. And then rural to urban. We live kind of here in a pretty urban environment, but as farming becomes not less important, but less people have to farm, you see more people moving away from farms to urban areas. Forced migration is a permanent movement, usually compelled by cultural factors, involves internally displaced people, refugees, and asylum seekers. Displaced persons and refugees, an internally displaced person, which also is called an IDP, has been forced to migrate for similar political reasons as refugees, but not migrate across an international border. So a really good example of here in the United States was the Trail of Tears. when they forced the Native Americans to move west. Those people were internally displaced people. It was an inter migration across in one country. So this is the route taken by the Native Americans that lived in the kind of the southwestern United States, and they were forced to move into Oklahoma. And that's why it made them internally displaced people, is because they were moving within one country versus international movement, which would make them be a refugee. So displaced persons and refugee. A refugee is someone who is forced to migrate from his or her home country and cannot return for fear of persecution because of his or her race, religion, nationality, membership in a social group, or political opinion. Largest numbers of refugees were in 2014 were forced to migrate from Afghanistan and from Syria because of the continuing civil wars. I really have to say, with COVID kind of taking over our news cycle, we have not heard a lot in recent times about Syrian refugees, which was kind of the bigger news story leading up to COVID, was the Syrian refugees. So you kind of wonder what's happening with a lot of those people. But for many years, people coming out of Syria was one of the major places where there was refugee situations. Neighboring countries receive most of them, so Pakistan and Iran from Afghanistan, and Lebanon and Turkey from Syria. And we still see a lot of people living in refugee camps. So asylum seeker is someone who has migrated to another country in hopes of being recognized as a refugee. So you can kind of see the breakdown of things here, where people are kind of destined to, where they're coming from. There's about 19.5 million refugees and 38.2 million internally displaced people, and 108 asylum seekers in 2004. So the breakdown is pretty high. Most of them are coming or going into Europe. So here are some examples of displaced people and refugees. Political. Many Afghan people moved to safer areas during the war between the U.S. and Taliban, which began in 2001. Refugees. Jews fled Nazi Germany in the 1930s and 40s, hoping to find safety in other countries. That's kind of the difference. When you're internal, they moved to safer places within the country, versus refugees who are trying to escape the country. Environmental. Thousands of Louisianans fled to neighboring states after Hurricane Katrina, and really stayed in those states after Hurricane Katrina in 2005. And then thousands of Haitians relocated to neighborhood countries after the Haitian earthquake in 2010. So they've left to go to neighboring countries. So that's kind of, again, internally displaced is within the country, refugee is leaving the country. So the last thing to talk about today is Ravenstein's law of migration. So Ravenstein is a German geographer in the 1880s, and he kind of noticed there are 8 patterns or laws about migration tendencies and demographics. So what he discovered is most migrants travel a pretty short distance. The farther the distance, the less likely they are to immigrate there. And that's called distance decay. So he kind of came up with the idea of distance decay, and realized that most immigrants don't want to move, to a really far away country. They want to stay fairly close to where they were. So when you see refugee situations, people who are refugees usually trying to get to the closest safe area. So when you look at Syria, which is on the Mediterranean Sea, many people are trying to escape to Europe because it's a safe place for them and it's close by. In the 1960s, this was explained to as time distance decay, the idea that things near each other are often more closely connected than things far apart. So just another way to think about distance decay and time distance decay, something we talked about in Unit 1. So we need to draw those connections across. When you do an FRQ for your AP exam, they're going to ask you to draw examples of something like distance decay in different units. So this would be the example through migration and population. So most migrants traveling long distance usually settle in large urban areas because they believe there are more opportunities there. There's greater pull in larger communities, the assumption that people tend to leave larger communities than small. Gravity model of migration, if you look at that. Cuban migration to the U.S. when Castro took office, most people settled in the closest state, which is Florida, and its biggest city, which is Miami. Today, more than 2/3 of the Cuban Americans in the U.S. live in Florida, and half of them live in the Miami area. So, that's a really good example of distance decay. Like Florida, especially Miami, is very close to Cuba, and so that's where most of the refugees fled to. Um, Cuban and Cuban Americans, just so you can kind of see, this is where most Cubans have settled, but you can kind of see where there's larger populations of other Cuban refugees or Cuban Americans. So then there's multiple step. Most migration occurs through step migration, a process in which migrants reach their eventual destination through a series of smaller moves. So it's pretty common practice in rural to urban migration. A migrant from a small town is most likely to move first to a larger town, then a smaller city, and finally the large city. So there's steps to the migration. You may move multiple times. And you may see step migration in your own life at some point where, and maybe not, but some of you might move to, let's say you're going to move to Chicago, or actually, let's say you go to NIU for college. That's a move, okay? Then you get a job in Chicago. That's another move. And then you suddenly have this great job in Chicago and you've been offered a job maybe in New York. And so you take that, which would be another step move. So it's just the steps to get a job. And then rural to urban, most migration in history has been from rural to urban and still continues today to be the most impactful form of migration. During the Industrial Revolution, this led to a decrease in need for laborers on farms, and cities needed more people to work in their factories, and then later to run their offices. So this rural to urban movement remains very common today. Within countries, rural residents of India moved to Indian cities like Mumbai, and between countries, rural residents of Syria moving into the cities in Germany. Again, rural to urban migration is less people need to farm and looking for more opportunities, they're going to move to cities. And that's it for today. So if you have any questions, let me know.